The people who quietly watch the room are usually the ones who understand it best. Rain slid slowly down the windows of Hartwell Grill like melting glass, blurring the neon open sign into soft red streaks across the empty street outside. It was almost 10:40 p.m. in downtown Portland, and only 3 tables were still occupied. A tired couple shared fries near the jukebox. A delivery driver drank black coffee by the door. And in booth 9, beneath the warm amber lights and the smell of burnt butter and grilled steak, sat a man nobody seemed to notice. He wore a faded charcoal jacket that looked 10 years old and carried himself like someone trying very hard not to be recognized. His beard was trimmed but uneven. His boots were wet from the rain. And yet something about him felt too controlled for the room around him. His name was Ethan Cole, though nobody inside the restaurant knew that. Not the dishwasher humming old country songs in the back. Not the manager counting receipts near the register. Not even the young waitress carrying 2 ceramic plates balanced carefully across one arm. But Claire Bennett noticed something strange the moment she walked past his table for the first time. It wasn't his clothes. It wasn't his posture. It was his eyes. Most customers looked at menus, or phones, or televisions mounted above the bar. Ethan watched people instead, quietly, carefully, like he was measuring something no one else could see. Claire stopped beside booth 9 with a small notepad in her hand. "Kitchen closes in 20 minutes, she said gently. "Can I get you started with something?" Ethan looked up slowly. His expression stayed unreadable. "What's the best steak here?" Claire glanced toward the kitchen window where steam floated into the dining room lights. "Depends what kind of night you're having." That answer seemed to catch him off guard. Just slightly. "Excuse me?" Claire gave a small shrug. "If it's been a long day, the ribeye. If you're celebrating something, New York strip. If you want honesty, the sirloin's cheaper and tastes almost the same after 10 at night." Ethan leaned back against the booth cushion, studying her now. Most waitresses tried too hard with customers, especially late at night. Bigger smiles, extra charm, higher tips. But Claire spoke to him like none of that mattered. "I'll take the sirloin," he said finally. "Medium rare." She nodded once. "Mashed potatoes or fries?" "Fries." "Drink." "Just water." Claire wrote nothing down. "Got it." As she turned away, Ethan watched her cross the restaurant floor without hesitation, weaving between tables with calm precision. No wasted movement, no fake energy. The kind of quiet confidence people usually earned the hard way. 10 minutes later, she returned with his steak sizzling beneath a square of melting herb butter. The smell alone filled the booth with warmth. She placed the plate down carefully. "Careful," she said softly. "Plate's hot." Ethan looked at the steak but didn't touch it immediately. Instead, he looked back up at her. "You always remember orders without writing them down?" Claire adjusted the sleeve of her dark green uniform. "Only when people say exactly what they mean." For the first time that night, Ethan almost smiled. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above the city. Inside, the overhead lights reflected softly against the rain-covered windows while steam rose slowly from the untouched steak between them. And somewhere beneath the silence of booth 9, a quiet little game had already begun. The steak cooled slowly beneath the restaurant lights while Ethan Cole continued watching the room instead of eating. Claire noticed it the second time she passed booth 9. Most customers cut into a steak within 30 seconds, especially after a long rainy night. But his knife and fork remained perfectly aligned beside the plate, untouched, almost staged there on purpose. The dinner rush had faded completely now. Somewhere in the kitchen, a dishwasher rattled silverware into plastic trays while an old jazz song drifted softly through the ceiling speakers. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows in uneven rhythms. Ethan finally picked up his fork when Claire returned with a fresh glass of water. "You always this quiet?" he asked without looking up. Claire placed the glass beside his plate. "Usually means I am listening." "To what?" She glanced toward the couple near the jukebox. "That table is about to break up." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "She keeps folding her napkin smaller every time he talks." Ethan looked over discreetly. The woman at the corner booth twisted her paper napkin again between nervous fingers while the man stared down at his phone. "And the truck driver near the door?" Ethan asked. Claire answered immediately. "Third coffee refill. Probably trying not to fall asleep before a long drive." "You know all your customers that well?" "Not really." She gave a small shrug. "People usually tell you everything before they speak." Ethan finally cut into the steak. Medium rare. Perfect center. He took one bite, then set the fork down again. "What if you are wrong?" Claire looked at him for half a second longer this time. "Then I apologize and move on." Something about that answer unsettled him slightly. Most people tried to impress difficult customers. Claire did not seem interested in winning or losing anything. She simply observed. Ethan leaned back into the booth. "What if someone lies to you?" Claire wiped a nearby table slowly with a folded towel. "Everybody lies a little." "Then how do you know who somebody really is?" She stopped wiping for a moment. "Patterns." Ethan almost smiled again. "That sounds dangerous." "Sometimes." "So what is my pattern?" Claire looked toward his untouched fries first. Then the way his jacket sleeve sat too neatly despite the cheap fabric. Then the faint indentation near his wrist where an expensive watch had probably rested for years before tonight. Tiny details. Tiny habits. "You ask questions you already know the answer to," she said calmly. Ethan stared at her now with full attention for the first time all night. "That bad?" "Depends why you are asking." Before he could answer, the manager shouted from the register. "Claire, table 4 needs ranch." "Coming." She walked away before the conversation could settle. Ethan watched her move across the dining room again, calm and steady despite the late hour and tired customers. No rush, no performance, just quiet awareness. He looked down at the steak once more, still hot in the center, barely touched. Then his eyes drifted toward the reflection in the rain-covered window beside him. For a brief second, he saw exactly what Claire had probably already seen from the beginning. A man pretending to disappear while secretly hoping somebody important would notice him anyway. And for the first time that evening, Ethan began wondering whether he was the one being studied. By 11:05 p.m., Hartwell Grill had grown quieter than usual. The couple near the jukebox had left separately. The truck driver finally folded a few dollar bills beneath his empty coffee mug and disappeared into the rain outside. Only booth 9 remained occupied now, glowing softly beneath the hanging amber light, while steam faded slowly from the untouched half of Ethan Cole's steak. Claire carried a tray of clean glasses toward the kitchen when she noticed him checking his phone for the first time all evening. Not scrolling, not texting, just reading a message with the kind of stillness that usually meant money was involved. Important money. His expression barely changed, but his posture did. Straighter, sharper, controlled. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket before anyone else could notice. Claire continued walking without staring, but she filed the detail away quietly. People always revealed themselves in transitions. The manager, Rick, emerged from the office near the register while rubbing tired eyes. "Claire, lock the front after the next customer leaves." "Got it." Rick glanced toward Ethan's booth. "That guy still camping there?" Claire stacked glasses beside the coffee station. "Seems harmless." Harmless people do not sit alone for 2 hours studying a restaurant menu like it is a legal contract. Claire smiled faintly but said nothing. Rick lowered his voice. "You want me to ask him if he needs anything else?" Claire looked toward booth 9 again. Ethan sat with one hand resting near the edge of the table, eyes drifting calmly around the restaurant like he owned silence itself. "No," she said softly. "He is waiting for something." Rick frowned. "What thing?" Claire grabbed the coffee pot. "Not sure yet." A few minutes later, she approached the booth again. "Can I warm that up for you?" Ethan looked down at the steak as if he had forgotten it existed. "No, it is fine. You barely touched it." "I was distracted." Claire nodded once. "Happens." Ethan studied her carefully. "You always this calm with strangers?" She reached for the water glass. "Most people are only strangers for about 5 minutes." And after that? They usually tell you who they are. Ethan leaned forward slightly. What if they do not want to? Claire picked up the empty basket of fries. Wanting does not really matter. For the first time that evening, silence lingered between them long enough to feel deliberate. Then Ethan reached for the steak knife. As he adjusted his sleeve, the cuff of his old jacket slipped back just enough for the overhead light to catch polished silver beneath it. Claire's eyes moved there instinctively. A watch. Elegant. Thin. Impossibly refined. Patek Philippe. White gold. The kind of watch people did not buy unless private drivers opened doors for them somewhere. Most people would not have recognized it. But Claire did. She noticed the moon phase dial first. Then the deep navy leather strap worn carefully with age. Ethan saw her eyes pause for less than a second before she looked away again. No surprise. No excitement. No change in behavior at all. That unsettled him more than recognition would have. Something wrong? He asked quietly. Claire adjusted the edge of the tablecloth near the salt shaker. No. You looked at my watch. It is beautiful. Ethan waited for the usual follow-up question. What do you do for work? Are you famous? Is it real? But none came. Claire simply stepped back from the booth. Kitchen closes in 10 minutes if you want dessert. Ethan stared at her. You know what that watch is worth? Claire met his eyes calmly. I know people who wear watches like that usually expect the room to react. Rain continued sliding down the dark windows behind him. Somewhere in the kitchen, the dishwasher stopped running. The restaurant suddenly felt smaller, quieter, like the night itself had leaned closer to hear what would happen next. Claire walked toward the kitchen after that sentence, leaving Ethan alone beneath the dim amber light with his cooling steak and the sound of rain brushing softly against the windows. He looked down at the Patek Philippe still visible beneath his sleeve and slowly adjusted the cuff back into place. Most people reacted instantly when they recognized wealth. Their voices changed. Their posture changed. Some became overly polite. Others became nervous. Claire had done neither. That bothered him more than he expected. In 20 years of building hotels, restaurants, and private clubs across the country, Ethan had learned something simple about people. Most of them revealed themselves the moment money entered the room. The expensive watch, the black card, the subtle mention of power. Everyone tilted eventually. Everyone wanted something. But Claire Bennett moved through the restaurant exactly the same way she had before she saw the watch. Calm, focused, untouched by it. Ethan leaned back in the booth, studying her again as she carried a tray of glasses toward the bar. No hesitation in her movements. No curiosity either. It felt almost impossible. He checked the time. 11:17. Hartwell Grill officially closed in 13 minutes. Rick stepped out from the kitchen carrying a stack of receipts and sighed heavily. Long night. Claire nodded while drying a coffee mug with a towel. Almost done. Rick glanced toward Ethan's table again. You want me to drop the check? Claire looked over briefly. I will handle it. Ethan noticed the exchange immediately. Another tiny detail. Rick deferred to her without realizing it. That usually meant competence. Or trust. Sometimes both. Claire walked back to booth 9 holding the coffee pot in one hand. Last refill before we close? Ethan looked up. Sure. She poured slowly while steam curled upward between them. You always work closing shifts? He asked. Mostly. Why? Claire placed the pot down carefully. People are more honest when they are tired. Ethan gave a faint laugh under his breath. You make everyone sound like a psychology experiment. Not everyone. Just me. You started asking questions first. Fair enough, he thought. Ethan reached for the water glass beside his plate. Then, very deliberately, he nudged the edge of it with his wrist. The glass tipped sideways instantly. Cold water spilled across the table, dripping onto the booth seat and splashing against the floor tiles below. Claire stepped back automatically to avoid the spill. Rick turned immediately from the register. Seriously. He rushed over with visible frustration. Claire, come on. Watch the table. Ethan said nothing. He simply watched. Claire grabbed a towel from her apron calmly and knelt beside the booth to clean the water from the floor. "It is fine," she said quietly. Rick exhaled sharply. "We close in 10 minutes and now this whole section needs drying." "I said it is fine." She kept wiping the floor without irritation, without embarrassment. Ethan studied her carefully while she worked. Most people defended themselves immediately when blamed unfairly. Claire did not even mention that he had caused it. That made him strangely uncomfortable. "It was my fault," Ethan finally said. Rick looked surprised for half a second. Claire did not. She simply stood, folded the damp towel neatly, and adjusted one corner of the tablecloth that had slipped loose during the spill. Then she looked directly at Ethan again. Calm as ever. "Accidents usually tell the truth faster than conversations do," she said softly. Ethan frowned slightly. "What is that supposed to mean?" Claire glanced briefly at the overturned glass still rolling gently near the edge of the booth. "People show who they are when things stop going according to plan." The restaurant grew quiet again after that. Almost too quiet. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, the dishwasher started humming once more. Rain continued falling outside beneath the glowing streetlights. And for the first time that night, Ethan had the uncomfortable feeling that his little test was beginning to move in a direction he no longer fully controlled. Midnight settled over Hartwell Grill slowly, like fog rolling across empty streets. The front sign had already been switched from open to closed, but the warm lights inside still glowed softly against the rain-dark windows. Booth 9 remained the only occupied table in the restaurant. Ethan sat alone now with the remains of his steak pushed slightly aside, his fingers resting near the edge of the table while Claire wiped down nearby counters in steady silence. Neither of them had spoken for almost 10 minutes, and somehow that silence felt heavier than the conversation before it. Ethan was not used to that feeling. Normally, people filled silence around him quickly. Employees rushed to impress him. Investors explained too much. Strangers became nervous if he stopped talking. But Claire moved through the quiet like she belonged there. Comfortable, unafraid. Ethan watched her stack clean coffee mugs beside the espresso machine while soft jazz drifted through the nearly empty dining room. "You always work this late?" he asked finally. Claire looked over her shoulder. "Rent likes consistency." "That sounds expensive." "Everything is expensive lately." Ethan nodded faintly. "Fair point." Claire walked toward his booth carrying the black leather check holder beneath one arm. No dramatic smile. No forced politeness. Just calm professionalism. She placed it gently beside the plate. "No rush," she said. Ethan glanced at the bill but did not open it yet. "Can I ask you something?" Claire folded her towel once before answering. "You usually do. Why did you not react to the watch?" Claire leaned lightly against the edge of the neighboring booth. "Was I supposed to?" "Most people would. Most people think expensive things explain somebody." Ethan studied her face carefully. "And you do not?" Claire shook her head once. "I think behavior explains people better than money does." The rain outside softened into a light drizzle now, barely audible against the glass. Somewhere in the back kitchen, Rick finished locking the freezer and called out a tired goodnight before disappearing through the employee exit. Claire and Ethan were alone now except for the low music overhead and the hum of the refrigerator coolers behind the bar. Ethan finally reached for the check holder and opened it slowly. The receipt sat neatly folded inside. Nothing unusual at first. Sirloin steak, fries, water, total after tax. But beneath the receipt was a second piece of paper folded carefully in half. Smaller, plain white. Ethan looked up instinctively. Claire had already turned away toward the coffee station. "What is this?" he asked. "Probably easier if you read it." Her voice remained calm. Ethan unfolded the paper slowly beneath the warm booth light. The handwriting was neat, simple. Only one sentence. "The richest people usually do not need strangers to feel important." Ethan stared at the words without moving. The restaurant seemed to shrink around him. The sound of rain faded. Even the music overhead suddenly felt distant. He read the sentence again more slowly this time, then once more after that. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. Not from anger, from recognition. Claire continued organizing silverware near the counter without watching him. That somehow made the note feel sharper. She had not written it for drama. She had written it because she already understood him. Ethan lowered the paper carefully onto the table beside the untouched half of his steak. "You think that is what I was doing?" he asked quietly. Claire finally looked back at him. "I think people who already know their value usually do not test other people to confirm it." Ethan said nothing. For the first time in years, no response arrived immediately in his mind. No clever answer. No defense. Just silence. The kind that settles over a room when somebody says the one thing nobody else was willing to say out loud. The note remained on the table between Ethan's hands long after the restaurant had gone completely silent. Outside, the rain had slowed to a thin silver mist drifting beneath the streetlights, but inside Hartwell Grill the air felt strangely still, as if the entire building had paused around one sentence written on a folded piece of paper. Ethan looked down at the words again. The richest people usually do not need strangers to feel important. Simple handwriting. No signature. No anger. Somehow that made it harder to ignore. Claire continued wiping the counter near the espresso machine with slow, practiced movements, giving him space instead of waiting for a reaction. Most people wanted reactions. Claire seemed more interested in truth. Ethan leaned back against the booth cushion and exhaled quietly through his nose. "You think you figured me out from one dinner?" Claire folded the towel neatly before answering. "No. Then why write it?" She walked toward the register and began organizing receipts beneath the soft yellow light overhead. "Because sometimes people already know the truth. They just need to hear it from someone who gains nothing by saying it." Ethan stared at her across the nearly empty restaurant. No bitterness in her voice. No attempt to embarrass him. Just calm honesty delivered without decoration. That unsettled him more than criticism ever had. "You know," he said after a moment, "most people would have acted differently after seeing that watch." Claire gave a faint smile without looking up. "Most people think money changes the value of a conversation. Does it not? Not the important ones." Ethan looked away briefly toward the dark windows. His own reflection stared back at him beside the empty booth across the aisle. Older than he remembered. More tired too. "You think I was trying to feel important tonight?" he said quietly. Claire rested both hands lightly on the counter. "I think you came in hoping to prove something." "About what?" "About people." Ethan did not answer immediately because she was right. For nearly 3 years, he had been quietly visiting restaurants, hotels, retail stores, and small businesses disguised as an ordinary customer. No assistance. No luxury car. No expensive suit. He told himself it was research. A way to understand customer service honestly. But somewhere along the way, the experiment had changed. He had started enjoying the moment people treated him differently after discovering who he really was. The apologies. The panic. The sudden respect. Claire's voice interrupted his thoughts softly. "Can I tell you something?" Ethan looked back at her. "Sure." The people who are truly confident usually do not need hidden tests. He almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny. Because it landed too close to something he had been avoiding for years. Claire walked toward booth 9 slowly now and reached for the empty water glass near his plate. "My father used to own a small repair shop," she said quietly. "Nothing fancy, just tires, oil changes, brake work. But he always said the same thing after difficult customers left." Ethan listened without moving. He said kind people are usually kind before they know who you are. The overhead lights reflected softly against the polished silver of Ethan's watch as his hand rested beside the folded note. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Claire gathered the check holder gently from the edge of the table. "We close in 5 minutes," she said. "No pressure." Ethan reached into his jacket slowly and removed a black credit card from the inside pocket. Heavy metal. Matte finish. No visible bank logo. Claire glanced at it once and immediately understood exactly how much money sat behind that single piece of metal. But her expression never changed. Not even slightly. That was the moment Ethan finally realized the strange discomfort sitting inside his chest all evening had nothing to do with being recognized. It came from meeting someone who could see wealth clearly and still refused to be impressed by it. Claire processed the payment without another comment. The black metal card slid through the reader beneath the register light, while soft rain continued tracing silver lines down the windows outside. Ethan remained seated in booth 9, watching her quietly now, no longer with the detached curiosity he had arrived with earlier that evening. Something had changed after the note. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to make silence feel different between them. Claire handed the card back with the printed receipt folded neatly beside it. "You are all set." Ethan looked at the receipt but did not stand. "You really are not curious?" Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. "About what? Who I am?" She gave a small tired smile. "Everybody is somebody. That is not an answer. Neither is most wealth." Ethan stared at her for a second longer before slipping the card back into his jacket pocket. Most people eventually asked questions once they saw signals like that card, the watch, the posture, the quiet confidence. Claire never did. It was almost unsettling how little she cared about the performance of status. Rick returned briefly from the back office carrying his car keys. "I am heading out," he said while grabbing his coat from the hook near the kitchen door. Then he glanced toward Ethan. "You still here?" Ethan nodded once. Rick lowered his voice toward Claire while pulling on his jacket. "That guy feels familiar for some reason." Claire continued stacking menus calmly. "Maybe you saw him somewhere before." "No," Rick muttered. "Feels more like television familiar." Ethan looked down at the table to hide the faint smile that almost appeared. Rick rubbed his forehead. "Whatever. Lock up when he leaves." "I will." The back door closed behind him a few seconds later, leaving only Claire and Ethan inside Hartwell Grill beneath the warm amber lights. The old jazz playlist had ended now, replaced by soft instrumental piano drifting quietly through the speakers overhead. Ethan finally stood from the booth and reached for his coat. "You know," he said slowly, "most people become very different after they realize somebody has money." Claire gathered the empty steak plate from the table. "Money magnifies people. It does not really change them." Ethan watched her carry the plate toward the kitchen window. "Where did you learn that?" Claire paused for a moment before answering. "New York." Ethan looked surprised. "You worked there." "A few years ago." She disappeared briefly into the kitchen before returning with a damp towel to wipe the table. "Private dining club in Manhattan." Ethan leaned lightly against the booth. "That explains the watch." Claire gave a small nod. "I used to serve hedge fund managers, tech founders, politicians. Men who measured entire rooms in 30 seconds. And most of them wanted the same thing." Ethan crossed his arms. "Respect." Claire looked directly at him. "Confirmation." That word landed quietly between them. She continued wiping the table while speaking calmly, almost thoughtfully now. "Some people become successful and slowly forget whether others like them for who they are or for what surrounds them. So they start creating little tests." Ethan said nothing. Claire folded the towel once more. "Cheap clothes, hidden wealth, fake situations, watching how strangers react." Ethan looked toward the rain-covered window beside the booth. "You make it sound pathetic." "No," Claire shook her head gently. "Just lonely." The honesty in her voice carried no cruelty at all. That somehow made it harder to defend himself against. Ethan slid one hand into his coat pocket and stared quietly at the folded note still resting beside the receipt. "You recognized it immediately?" he asked. "The watch." Claire nodded. "And the questions?" "What questions?" "People with real power usually ask the room who it becomes around them." Ethan exhaled slowly. "And what did this room become?" Claire glanced around the empty restaurant. The polished counters, the cooling coffee machine, the half-faded neon reflection against the rain-dark glass. Then she looked back at him one final time before answering softly. "Honestly." Ethan nodded. "A place where you stopped pretending not to want to be seen." 2 nights later, the rain returned to downtown Portland just after sunset. Thin silver streaks slid across the windows of Hartwell Grill, while headlights reflected softly against the wet pavement outside. Inside the restaurant, the dinner rush had begun early. Plates clattered through the kitchen pass. Glasses chimed together behind the bar. Rick moved quickly between tables with the nervous energy of someone already behind schedule. Claire tied her dark green apron at the coffee station and glanced at the reservation screen near the register. Full house until closing. Table 12 needs extra napkins, Rick called out while carrying 2 plates of ribs toward the dining room. Got it. Claire grabbed a stack of folded napkins and moved through the crowded restaurant with the same steady calm she carried every night. No wasted motion. No panic. Just quiet rhythm beneath the warm amber lights. The front door opened suddenly behind her, letting in a gust of cold rain air. First, nobody looked up. Then the room changed. Not loudly. Subtly. A silence here. Pause there. One server nearly stopped walking mid-step. Rick turned toward the entrance and froze completely. 3 black SUVs sat parked outside beneath the glowing streetlights. 2 men in dark coats stepped inside first, scanning the restaurant automatically before moving aside near the door. And then Ethan Cole entered behind them. No faded jacket this time. No worn boots. No attempt to disappear. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a perfectly tailored navy suit, the white gold watch visible openly beneath the cuff now. The room reacted exactly the way Ethan had spent years pretending not to enjoy. Conversations lowered. Eyes followed him. Recognition spread slowly from table to table. One man near the bar whispered something into his wife's ear while looking at Ethan in disbelief. Rick blinked twice. No way, he muttered under his breath. Claire stood near the coffee station holding folded napkins against one arm. Her expression did not change at all. Ethan noticed that immediately. One of the security men approached quietly. Sir, we can reserve the private room if you prefer. Ethan shook his head. No, his eyes moved calmly across the restaurant until they found booth 9 near the rain-covered window. I will sit there. Rick rushed forward nervously. Mr. Cole, welcome to Hartwell Grill. We had no idea. Ethan stopped him gently with one hand. I know. Rick straightened his posture instantly. Anything you need tonight is on the house. Ethan glanced briefly toward Claire before answering. I would rather pay. Rick laughed awkwardly. Of course. Absolutely. Claire walked toward the booth carrying a menu even though they both knew he did not need one. She placed it on the table quietly. Good evening. Ethan looked up at her beneath the warm amber light. Evening. No tension in her voice. No sudden excitement. Just the same calm tone from 2 nights earlier. Around them, the restaurant buzzed softly with whispered curiosity. A teenage busboy nearly dropped a tray after recognizing Ethan from a business magazine cover online. Rick kept checking the dining room every 30 seconds as if expecting television cameras to appear. Ethan removed his coat slowly and sat down in booth 9 again. The same booth. The same rain against the windows. But nothing felt the same anymore. Claire placed a glass of water beside him. The usual? She asked softly. Ethan almost smiled. You remembered. Claire adjusted the edge of the menu slightly. You said exactly what you meant. Ethan looked at her for a long moment while the noise of the restaurant faded quietly into the background again. 2 nights earlier, he had walked into Hartwell Grill hoping strangers would reveal themselves to him. Tonight, surrounded by recognition, expensive watches, security guards, and nervous attention, he finally understood something uncomfortable. Claire Bennett had been the only person in the room who treated him exactly the same before and after knowing who he really was. The restaurant stayed busy long after Ethan arrived, but booth 9 somehow remained wrapped in its own quiet atmosphere beside the rain-covered window. Customers continued whispering across the dining room while phones discreetly appeared beneath tables. A few people pretended not to recognize him. Most failed. Rick nearly hovered every time Ethan lifted his water glass, terrified something might go wrong in front of one of the most recognizable hospitality executives in America. Claire treated him exactly like Table 9. Nothing more, nothing less. By 9:30 p.m. The dinner crowd had finally begun thinning out. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the glow from downtown Portland reflected across the wet sidewalks outside. Ethan finished the last bite of his steak and leaned back slightly in the booth. "Still the sirloin?" Claire asked while collecting an empty appetizer plate from a nearby table. Ethan looked at her with a faint smile. "Still honest after 10 at night." Claire almost smiled back at that. Almost. She brought the check a few minutes later inside the same black leather holder from before. No ceremony. No awkwardness. Ethan opened it quietly while the soft piano music drifted overhead again. The total sat neatly printed at the bottom beside a simple thank you message from the restaurant. Ethan reached into his jacket and placed several crisp $100 bills inside the folder before closing it again. Far too much for the meal. Then he slid the holder toward the edge of the table. Claire picked it up automatically. The moment she opened it, her eyes paused briefly. The cash tip was enormous. Enough to cover rent for months. Rick noticed instantly from behind the register and nearly choked on his coffee. "Holy!" He stopped himself midway through the sentence. Claire looked from the money back to Ethan. "This is too much." Ethan rested one arm along the booth seat. "No, it is not." Claire stood quietly for a second while rain slid down the dark glass behind him. Then she removed nearly all the bills from the folder, leaving only enough to cover a normal gratuity beside the receipt. Rick stared in disbelief. "Claire!" She ignored him gently and walked back toward booth 9 holding the remaining cash in one hand. Ethan looked genuinely surprised when she placed it back on the table. "You forgot this." "No," he said softly. "I meant it." Claire nodded once. "I know." Ethan glanced at the money. "Then why give it back?" Claire folded the leather check holder closed carefully before answering. "Because generosity means less when it feels like an apology." The words settled quietly between them. No accusation. No judgment. Just truth delivered gently enough to leave room for dignity. Ethan looked down at the folded bills for several seconds without touching them. Around them, the restaurant noise had faded into the background again. One server refilled ketchup bottles near the kitchen. Someone laughed softly near the bar. Rain continued falling outside in slow silver lines. Claire slid the receipt slightly closer to him. "You already paid for dinner." Ethan looked up at her. "And if I wanted to do something nice?" Claire gave a faint tired smile. "Then do it before people make you feel guilty." Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Not amused. More like recognition. Claire turned to leave, but Ethan noticed something handwritten near the bottom of the receipt beneath her neat signature. Just one sentence. Small enough most people would miss it. He read it slowly. "Kind people do not perform kindness." Ethan stared at the line while Claire walked calmly back toward the coffee station beneath the warm amber lights. No dramatic goodbye. No attempt to impress him. Just the same quiet steadiness she had carried from the beginning. Outside, the rain finally began easing over the city. Ethan folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket instead of throwing it away. Then he stood from booth 9 and looked around Hartwell Grill one last time before walking toward the door. Rick thanked him 3 different times before he reached the exit. Ethan barely heard him. His attention stayed on Claire. She was wiping down the counter again exactly the same way she had the first night he met her. Calm. Unchanged. Unmoved by money or status or attention. And as Ethan stepped out into the cool Portland night beneath the fading rain, he realized something that stayed with him far longer than the taste of the steak or the embarrassment of the note. The rarest thing he found inside that small restaurant was not honesty. It was someone who never needed his wealth to decide how much respect he deserved.